There's a 30-ton excavator sinking into the mud halfway up my driveway, and it's been there for 3 weeks. Every morning I drink my coffee on the porch and watch the HOA president's contractor try to figure out how to drag it out of the ravine without rolling the whole rig. He can't. He ignored 3 different no trespassing signs because the neighborhood board told him my land was a public easement. It wasn't. Now his truck belongs to the mountain. My property sits on 42 acres of vertical rock, dense pine, and spite. When I bought the land a decade ago, the valley below was nothing but an old, failing dairy farm. The air smelled of manure and sweetgrass, and the only noise came from the coyotes. I carved my driveway out of the mountain with a rented bulldozer and months of backbreaking labor. It is a mile-long, steep, winding ribbon of crushed gravel and packed clay. It is not designed for casual Sunday driving. It requires 4-wheel drive, good ground clearance, and a healthy respect for gravity. Then the developers arrived. They bought out the dairy farm, flattened the rolling pastures, and poured asphalt that smelled like hot tar and fast money. Within 2 years, 40 identical stucco boxes sprouted from the dirt. They named the subdivision Whisper Ridge. I call it the Beige Plague. The houses were crammed together on quarter-acre lots, boasting faux stone facades and 0 lot line fences. Naturally, an HOA was formed before the paint was even dry on the community center. Brenda was the president. She was a woman who navigated the world with the unearned confidence of someone who had never been punched in the mouth. She wore pastel tracksuits, drove a pristine white luxury SUV that had never seen a speck of dirt, and carried a clipboard as if it were a broadsword. For the first year, Whisper Ridge and I existed in a state of cold indifference. I stayed on my mountain. They stayed in their cul-de-sacs. The trouble started when the developers' cheap engineering caught up with them. The backyards of lots 18 through 22 abutted the base of my mountain. To maximize the flat space for these lots, the builders had cut aggressively into the hillside and erected a flimsy timber retaining wall. After a particularly wet spring, that wall began to bow. The hillside was threatening to slide down and crush Brenda's prized azaleas, along with 4 other meticulously manicured backyards. They needed to build a massive engineered concrete retaining wall. To do that, they needed heavy machinery. And to get the heavy machinery to the top of the crumbling slope, they needed access. The only access point that didn't involve destroying 3 houses in the subdivision was a service road that supposedly ran along the ridge. The problem was that service road didn't exist. The only road up the mountain was my private driveway. Brenda did not ask for permission. She marched up the first quarter-mile of my driveway on a humid Tuesday morning, her white sneakers getting dusted with my gravel. I happened to be down by the lower gate, clearing brush with a chainsaw. I killed the engine when I saw her approaching. She did not introduce herself. She tapped her pen against her clipboard and informed me that the Whisper Ridge Homeowners Association would be utilizing my access road starting the following Monday. She spoke with a clipped, nasal authority, explaining that a contractor would be bringing an excavator and several dump trucks up the hill to reinforce the boundary. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and told her she was mistaken. My road was private property. Brenda scoffed. She unclipped a laminated map from her board and shoved it toward my chest. She pointed to a dotted line that ran across the topography. She claimed the developer had secured a utility and access easement before the subdivision was even finalized. She told me I had no legal right to block them, and that if I attempted to interfere with the contractor, the HOA would find me and take legal action. I looked at the map. I knew exactly what that dotted line was. It was a proposed easement from 20 years ago, drafted by the previous landowner. It was never filed. It was never finalized. When I bought the land, the title search came back completely clean. I owned the dirt, the rock, and the road, right down to the iron pins, driven into the ground at the property line. I handed her map back. I told her she was trespassing, and that if she or her contractors set foot on my road again, I would have them removed by the county sheriff. Brenda's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. She accused me of being unneighborly. She threatened to sue me for negligence if the hillside collapsed. She promised me that the trucks were coming whether I liked it or not. Then she turned and marched back down the hill, her white sneakers kicking up angry little clouds of dust. That weekend I went to the hardware store. I did not buy the cheap, flimsy plastic signs that fade in the sun. I bought heavy-gauge aluminum signs with industrial reflective lettering, private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted, no turnaround. I rented a post hole digger. I sank steel poles 3 feet deep into the rocky soil at the entrance of my driveway. I poured quick-setting concrete. I mounted the first sign squarely at eye level for anyone sitting in a truck cab. I mounted a second sign 50 yards up the road directly after the first curve. I mounted a third right before the Devil's Elbow, the steepest, most treacherous switchback on the entire mountain. I drew the line in iron and concrete. I figured that would be the end of it. I underestimated the sheer, blinding arrogance of a contractor getting paid by an HOA. The sky opened up on a Tuesday. It was not a gentle, misty morning rain. It was a torrential, angry downpour that turned the sky the color of bruised iron. Water sheeted off the metal roof of my cabin, sounding like a continuous drum roll. Up here on the mountain, heavy rain means the clay turns into a slick, unforgiving grease. The gravel washes out, and the ground softens enough to swallow a boot up to the ankle. It is the absolute worst time to drive anything heavier than a mountain bike up my road. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking dark roast coffee, and watching the runoff carve tiny rivers through my yard. When I felt the vibration, it started low, a hum in the floorboards that vibrated up through the soles of my boots. Then came the sound, the deep, guttural roar of a heavy diesel engine being pushed to its absolute limit. It was the sound of a transmission screaming in a low gear, accompanied by the distinct, rhythmic whine of massive tires spinning and slipping against wet stone. Someone was trying to come up the mountain. I grabbed my slicker, shoved my feet into my muck boots, and stepped out into the deluge. The cold rain hit my face like buckshot. I walked down the path from my cabin to the edge of the ridge, looking down through the dripping pine branches toward the lower switchbacks. A massive plume of black exhaust was rising through the trees near the second curve. I started down the driveway, the mud pulling at my boots with every step. When I rounded the bend just above the Devil's Elbow, I stopped dead in my tracks. A massive Peterbilt flatbed truck was angled awkwardly across the width of my driveway. Attached to the flatbed was a heavy-duty lowboy trailer. Sitting on the trailer was a yellow Caterpillar excavator, easily weighing 30 tons. The truck was branded with the words Sullivan Earthworks on the door. The driver had managed to brute force his way past the first 2 signs, likely relying on momentum and ignorance. But the Devil's Elbow is a 20-degree incline on a sharp hairpin turn. The gravel there is thin. Beneath it is pure, slick red clay. The truck was completely immobilized. The rear dual tires of the cab were buried up to the axles in mud, spinning furiously and throwing massive rooster tails of slop into the forest. The long, heavy trailer had cut the corner too sharp. Its rear wheels had slipped off the compacted gravel and were now resting precariously on the soft shoulder. Beyond that shoulder was a sheer 40-foot drop into a wooded ravine. I walked down the side of the road, keeping clear of the spinning tires and the massive groaning weight of the machine. The driver, a thick-necked man with a graying beard and a terrified expression, was furiously shifting gears, trying to rock the massive rig back and forth. Every time he hit the gas, the trailer slid another inch toward the edge of the ravine. The entire setup was groaning under the twisting torsion. I banged my fist hard on his window. He jumped, startled, then rolled the glass down an inch. The smell of burning diesel and scorching rubber poured out of the cab. "Kill the engine!" I yelled over the roar of the rain and the machinery. "You're going to roll the whole rig down the mountain." The man glared at me, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I need to get up to the ridge. The HOA sent me." "This is private property," I shouted back. "Didn't you see the 3 metal signs you drove past?" "Brenda said you were a crank," he yelled, wiping condensation from the inside of his windshield. "She said it's a legal easement. I just need to punch through this mud." He revved the engine again, dumping the clutch. The Peterbilt shuddered violently. The heavy lug tires dug deeper, hitting the slick bedrock beneath the clay. The truck slid sideways. The massive yellow excavator on the trailer lurched, shifting its weight. The metal tie-down chains snapped taut with a sound like a rifle shot. The rear passenger side tires of the trailer dropped off the edge of the shoulder. The entire rig titled sharply to the right. The driver slammed on the brakes, cutting the engine in sheer panic. The sudden silence was deafening, leaving only the sound of the rain and the slow, terrifying groan of metal straining against gravity. I looked at the driver. His face was entirely devoid of color. He slowly opened the door and climbed down, moving with exaggerated care, as if a sudden sneeze would send the whole operation tumbling into the abyss. His boots hit the mud, and he immediately sank to his shins. "Well," I said, looking at the buried axles and the trailer hanging off the cliff. "You punched through the mud." Sullivan stared at his truck. The reality of the physics was finally settling in. A rig that heavy, angled that severely on wet clay, could not be driven out. It couldn't even be towed out by a standard wrecker. "I have a job to do," he stammered, pulling a soaked cell phone from his pocket. "I need to call a tow." "You're going to need a lot more than a tow," I told him, pulling my own phone out of my rain jacket. "And you need to stand back. I'm calling the sheriff." Sullivan tried to argue, claiming this was an HOA matter, a civil dispute over an easement. I ignored him and dialed dispatch. I told them I had a trespasser who had just destroyed my private road and abandoned a commercial vehicle on a blind, hazardous curve. 20 minutes later, Deputy Miller arrived in his four-wheel drive cruiser. He parked 50 yards down the hill, out of the slide zone, and walked up through the rain. Miller is a local guy. He knows the mountain, and he knows my road. He walked up, looked at the buried Peterbilt, looked at the excavates tilting precariously over the drop-off, and then looked at the heavy metal "No Trespassing" sign planted firmly in the ground just a few feet away. Miller pushed his wet hat back on his head, crossed his arms, and let out a long, low whistle. He turned to the contractor, who was shivering in the rain. "Son," Miller said, shaking his head, "you are completely, undeniably stuck." Deputy Miller stood in the pouring rain, the water dripping steadily from the brim of his hat, radiating a calm that deeply unsettled Sullivan. Miller did not shout. He did not wave his hands. He simply pulled a waterproof notepad from his breast pocket and began taking down the truck's plate numbers. Sullivan was pacing the narrow strip of intact gravel, his high-vis jacket soaked dark, screaming into his phone. He was trying to get a tow. It was a futile exercise. When you tell a dispatcher that a commercial semi carrying a 30-ton excavator is teetering on the edge of a ravine in a rainstorm on a private mountain road, they do not send a standard flatbed. They laugh, tell you to hold, and transfer you to the heavy recovery specialists. These are the guys who pull flip tractor trailers out of frozen rivers. They are not cheap, and they do not rush. 2 hours passed. The rain slowed to a miserable, persistent drizzle. My driveway was a ruin of deep ruts and overturned clay. Eventually, the throaty rumble of a massive diesel engine echoed up the valley. A heavy-duty rotator wrecker, a monstrous piece of machinery that looked like a cross between a fire engine and a construction crane, slowly ground its way up my driveway. The driver stopped 50 yards below the Devil's Elbow, clearly unwilling to test the structural integrity of the mud any further. A man who looked exactly like the kind of person you hire to pull a Peterbilt out of a ditch stepped out. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a grease-stained hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low. He trudged up the hill, his boots sinking into the muck. "I'm Hank," he grunted, looking past Sullivan to stare at the dangling trailer. Hank did not say another word for 5 full minutes. He walked the perimeter of the trapped rig. He knelt in the mud to inspect the rear axles of the cab, which were now buried completely to the differential. He looked at the trailer's wheels, hanging in the open air. He tossed a small rock over the edge of the shoulder and listened as it tumbled down through the pine branches for 40 feet. Sullivan hovered behind him like an anxious child. "Can you winch it backward?" Hank stood up and wiped wet clay from his hands onto his pants. "No." "What do you mean, no?" Sullivan's voice cracked. "I have a heavy-duty chain in the cab. You just hook up to the front axle and pull. Hank looked at Sullivan with a mixture of pity and profound exhaustion. Buddy, you have about 60,000 pounds of excavator sitting on a trailer that is currently fighting gravity. The only thing keeping that yellow machine from rolling into the trees is the kingpin connecting the trailer to your cab. If I hook a winch to your front bumper and drag you backward, the trailer wheels are going to slide further off the soft shoulder. The moment that trailer tilts past 45 degrees, the excavator snaps the chains, rolls off, and takes your cab with it. If I pull you, I kill the truck. Sullivan opened his mouth, then closed it. The blood drained off his face. Hank turned to me. Your road. My road, I said. And my no trespassing signs. Hank nodded slowly. It's a bad spot. To get this out, I need a second rotator truck up here to anchor the trailer while I pull the cab. But I can't fit two rotators side by side on this grade. The road isn't wide enough. He paused, looking back at the Peterbilt. The only way to move this safely is to unload the excavator first. I can't unload it, Sullivan yelled, panic finally setting in. The ramps are over the edge. If I try to track that excavator off the bed, the weight shift will flip the whole rig. Hank shrugged. Then she sits. I'm not risking a $500,000 tow truck trying to pull a dead man's rig out of the mud. He turned around and started walking back down the hill. Sullivan chased after him, begging, offering double his rate. Hank just kept walking, shaking his head. The heavy wrecker backed slowly down the mountain, its backup alarm echoing through the wet trees like a mocking metronome. 10 minutes later, a white luxury SUV appeared at the bottom of the driveway, stopping just past my iron gates. Brenda had arrived. She did not hike up the mountain. She stood at the bottom of the steepest grade, holding a massive golf umbrella, yelling up at us. Her voice carried surprisingly well through the damp air. She demanded to know why the truck wasn't at the ridge. She demanded to know why the contractor was standing in the rain. Deputy Miller sighed, closed his notepad, and began the slow, slippery walk down to the gate. I followed a few paces behind. Sullivan stayed with his truck, looking like a captain going down with a very expensive, very yellow ship. Ma'am, you need to step back onto the public street, Miller said as we approached. Brenda pointed a manicured finger at me. Arrest him. He is obstructing a vital community infrastructure project. I showed him the easement map. I saw the map, Miller replied gently, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. The county clerk's office doesn't have any record of it. This is private property. Your contractor drove past 3 posted signs and destroyed a private driveway. Right now, this is a civil matter. But if you don't step off this gentleman's land, it becomes a criminal one. Brenda's mouth fell open. She looked at Miller, then at me. The absolute certainty of her suburban authority was cracking against the immovable reality of rural property rights. She sputtered something about the retaining wall, about the safety of the neighborhood, about property values. Your property values aren't my problem, I told her, my voice low and flat over the sound of the rain. Fool, you lied to a contractor to force your way onto my land. Now his truck is stuck, my road is ruined, and you're standing in my driveway. She glared at me with a hatred so pure it could have cut glass. She turned on her heel, marched back to her SUV, and slammed the door. The tires spun on the wet asphalt as she sped away. Miller watched her go, then turned to me. Well, you've got a hell of a lawn ornament up there. What happens now? I asked. Now, Miller adjusted his hat. Now you call a lawyer, because that truck isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The rain finally stopped on Thursday morning, replaced by a brutal, baking sun that baked the mountain in a blanket of humid heat. The thick red clay that had trapped Sullivan's rig slowly began to cure. It didn't dry into dust. It hardened into something resembling cheap concrete. The tires of the Peterbilt were now entombed halfway up the rubber. The mud had locked the axles, the drivetrain, and the sheer weight of the excavator into a permanent sculpture of mechanical failure. Living with a 60,000-pound roadblock requires a fundamental shift in your daily routine. I couldn't drive my truck down to the valley. To get groceries, to get mail, to leave my property at all, I had to strap on a backpack, hike a half-mile down the steep grade, carefully squeeze past the tilting yellow excavator, and walk the rest of the way to the county road, where a friend let me park a spare beater car. Every time I walked past the truck, the smell of diesel and hot steel hung in the air. The suspension groaned under the shifting thermal weight of the sun. It felt less like a vehicle and more like a massive dying beast that had crawled onto my land to expire. On Friday afternoon, the mail carrier refused to leave his truck and handed me a certified envelope through the window. The return address belonged to a high-rise law firm. Downtown, Brenda had decided to double down. I sat on my porch with a cold beer and tore open the envelope. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It was 5 pages of dense, threatening jargon accusing me of tortious interference, unlawful detainment of commercial equipment, and reckless endangerment of community infrastructure. The HOA's lawyer claimed that the unrecorded easement was valid through historical precedents and demanded I immediately grant full access to their recovery teams or face a lawsuit for the daily rental cost of the excavator, which they helpfully noted was $1,500 a day. They gave me 48 hours to comply. I didn't panic. I finished my beer, put the letter in my truck, and hiked down the mountain. I drove into town and walked into the office of a property lawyer named Robert. Robert was in his late 60s, wore suits that were slightly out of style, and had a framed map of the county from 1950 on his wall. He didn't practice corporate law, he practiced dirt law. He knew exactly who owned every rock, stream, and fence post within 50 miles. I dropped the HOA's letter on his desk. He put on his reading glasses, skimmed the first page, and chuckled softly. Historical precedents, Robert wheezed, tossing the letter aside. That's a cute way of saying we have absolutely no legal right to be there. They're citing a proposed subdivision plan that the county rejected 20 years ago because the grade was too steep for emergency vehicles. Your title is clear. They are trespassing, period. So what's the play? I asked. Robert pulled a fresh legal pad toward him. We hit back harder. They want to talk about daily costs? We hold them liable for the destruction of your road. We file for an injunction. We demand compensation for the trespass. And we inform them that any further unauthorized attempts to bring machinery onto your land will be met with a call to the EPA. I raised an eyebrow. The EPA? That truck is sitting on a sharp incline, carrying hundreds of gallons of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid, Robert said, his eyes gleaming with the predatory joy of a lawyer who has just found the perfect pressure point. If that rig shifts and a line snaps, it drains straight into the watershed. The environmental fines would bankrupt their HOA before the cleanup even started. We drafted the response. It was polite, brutal, and legally airtight. We sent it via courier that afternoon. Saturday morning, I was outside fixing a chainsaw chain when I heard footsteps crunching on the dry gravel below. I stood up and looked down the driveway. Sullivan was walking up the mountain. He looked 10 years older than he had on Tuesday. He wore a faded t-shirt and work boots, his shoulders slumped, breathing heavily in the summer heat. He wasn't carrying a clipboard or a phone. He just looked defeated. He stopped at my gate, resting his forearms on the metal bar, looking up at me. I got a call from the HOA, Sullivan said, his voice raspy. They fired me. I set the chainsaw down on the workbench and walked over to the fence. I'm sorry to hear that. Brenda told me it was a done deal. She said the neighborhood owned the road. He rubbed at his face with calloused, dirty hands. I owe the rental company $30,000 for the month on that excavator. My insurance won't cover a recovery operation because I bypassed posted no trespassing signs. They're calling it negligence. He looked past me, up the winding, ruined road toward his trapped livelihood. I'm going to lose my business, he said quietly. It wasn't a plea for help. It was just a man stating a terrifying, inescapable fact. I felt a sudden sharp pang of sympathy. Sullivan was arrogant to drive past my signs. Yes, he was foolish to trust an HOA president without checking the paperwork. But he wasn't the villain here. He was a working guy who had been used as a battering ram by a woman who thought pastel tracksuits and neighborhood covenants made her a god. Come inside, I told him, unlocking the gate. I'll make some coffee. We need to talk about how we're going to use your truck to destroy Brenda's life. Sullivan looked at me, confusion warring with a tiny, fragile spark of hope. He stepped through the gate. Sullivan sat at my heavy oak kitchen table, staring down into a chipped mug of black coffee, as if it contained the answers to his ruined life. He looked small, stripped of his massive truck and his roaring machinery. He was just a middle-aged man in a dirty t-shirt, drowning in debt. The mountain was quiet outside, save for the wind rattling the metal roof. The silence inside the cabin was thick, heavy with the reality of 30 tons of stranded steel sitting a quarter-mile down the driveway. I did not offer him platitudes. I poured myself a cup, sat across from him, and asked for the paperwork. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded, sweat-stained manila envelope. He slid it across the wood. Inside was the contract he signed with the Whisper Ridge Homeowners Association. It was a standard work order for retaining wall reinforcement and earth-moving services. But as I read through the fine print, my eyes caught a specific clause buried on the third page. Brenda had signed it as the sole authorizing agent. There was no secondary signature from the board treasurer. More importantly, there was a specific indemnity clause where the HOA claimed full responsibility for securing all necessary permits, easements, and access rights prior to the commencement of work. I tapped the paper with my index finger. She lied to you in writing. Sullivan rubbed his eyes, the rough sound of calluses against tired skin filling the quiet room. It doesn't matter. The rental company wants their 30 grand. My commercial insurance agent laughed at me on the phone this morning. They consider ignoring posted trespassing signs an intentional act of negligence. They are dropping my policy. I am going to lose my house to pay for a machine I cannot physically return. You are not losing your house, I told him, keeping my voice level and absolute. But you need to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a partner. Brenda used you as a blunt instrument. Now we are going to use your truck as an anchor. But to do that, you have to let go of the idea that you are getting that excavator back this week. Sullivan looked up, his eyes bloodshot and confused. What are you talking about? Right now that rig is abandoned property on my land, I explained, leaning forward. If you try to claim it, the rental company sues you, and the HOA washes their hands of the whole mess. They fired you to sever their liability. They want you to take the fall for the trespassing and the property damage. We are not going to let them. I laid out the plan. It was petty, it was legally aggressive, and it required a level of calculated cruelty that Brenda had practically begged for. I told him we were going down to Robert's office. Sullivan was going to sign a document admitting fault for the trespass, but explicitly citing the fraudulent contract provided by the HOA as the direct cause. Then, he was going to surrender temporary custodial rights of the equipment to me, acknowledging that the rig could not be moved safely without causing a catastrophic environmental spill or further destroying my property. Finally, I was going to place a commercial storage line on the equipment. A storage line? Sullivan asked, his brow furrowing. My property is not a free parking lot, I said. I'm going to charge a daily impound fee for the storage of hazardous commercial machinery. Let us call it $2,000 a day, since the HOA signed a contract claiming responsibility for the access route, and their fraudulent claim resulted in the equipment being stranded. That daily fee gets billed directly to the Whisper Ridge Homeowners Association. A slow, grim realization crept across Sullivan's face. The panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, hardening anger. He picked up his coffee and took a long drink. They fired me to save themselves. You want to chain them to the sinking ship. I want to drown them with it, I corrected. Are you in? We left the mugs on the table and hiked down the mountain. We squeezed past the looming yellow excavator. It looked even more precarious in the baking afternoon sun. The clay around the tires had cured into a cement-like crust. The trailer was leaning at a gut-wrenching angle. Sullivan patted the cold steel of the Peterbilt as we squeezed by, a silent apology to a machine that had served him well. We drove my battered sedan into town and walked into Robert's office. The old dirt lawyer listened to our plan, read through Brenda's signed contract, and let out a laugh that sounded like a tractor engine turning over. It is vicious, Robert said, pulling a fresh stack of legal paper from his drawer. It is highly combative. It will tie this up in civil court for months. He looked at us over the rim of his glasses. I love it. For the next 3 hours, the air in the small office smelled of old books and laser printer ozone. Robert drafted a masterpiece of legal warfare. We officially transferred the liability from Sullivan to the HOA, using Brenda's own signature as the binding chain. We established the daily storage fee, backdated to the moment the truck got stuck. We drafted a formal notice to the equipment rental company, informing them that their machinery was currently impounded due to HOA fraud and redirecting their collection efforts to Whisper Ridge. And then Robert added his own special touch. "I am filing a preemptive environmental hazard notice with the county," Robert said, signing the bottom of a form. "We are putting it on the public record that the HOA's actions have positioned 300 gallons of diesel fuel directly above the municipal watershed. If a drop spills, the county fines them. Not you, Sullivan. Not you either." He pointed his pen at me. "Brenda, we mailed the package by certified overnight delivery." Sullivan looked lighter when we walked out of the office. The crushing weight of bankruptcy had been lifted from his shoulders and placed squarely onto the manicured lawns of the beige plague. The first sign that our legal mortar shell had landed came on Tuesday morning. A pale, nervous-looking kid in a cheap suit parked his sedan at the bottom of my driveway and taped a manila envelope to my first "No Trespassing" sign. He took a photo of it with his phone and practically ran back to his car. I hiked down, tore the envelope off the metal post, and read the contents while standing in the shade of the pines. It was a summons, not a lawsuit, but an urgent, desperate demand for my presence at an emergency Whisper Ridge community meeting that evening. The letterhead was different. It did not come from the high-rise law firm Brenda had used for her initial threat. It came directly from the HOA board's internal secretary. Brenda was losing control of the narrative. The weather was shifting again. The oppressive heat of the past few days had broken, replaced by a heavy, gray humidity that smelled like incoming rain. I looked over at the subdivision in the valley below. Behind lots 18 through 22, the timber retaining wall was visibly failing. Even from a distance, I could see the wood bowing outward, the earth behind it swollen and heavy. If it rained heavily again, that hill was coming down, taking the azaleas, the patio furniture, and possibly the sunrooms with it. I called Sullivan. I told him to put on a clean shirt. We were going to a town hall. The Whisper Ridge Community Center was a sterile, echoing room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead. When Sullivan and I walked through the double-glass doors, the room fell dead silent. There were roughly 50 residents sitting in cheap folding chairs. They looked terrified, angry, and exhausted. Brenda sat at a folding table at the front of the room. She was not wearing her usual pastel tracksuit. She wore a stiff beige blazer, and her face was pulled tight with stress. Next to her sat two other board members, a nervous man named Tom, who kept adjusting his collar, and an older woman named Sarah, who was glaring daggers at Brenda. I did not sit down. I stood at the back of the room, leaning against the cinder block wall. Sullivan stood next to me, his arms crossed over his chest, looking like a bouncer at the gates of hell. Brenda picked up a wooden gavel and tapped it weakly against the table. "I call this emergency session to order. We are here to discuss the logistical delays regarding the retaining wall project and the extortion attempts by the neighboring landowner." A man in the third row stood up. He did not look at Brenda. He turned and looked directly at me. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. "Is it true that our HOA is being billed $2,000 a day because that truck is stuck on your property?" "Yes," I said loudly, my voice carrying easily over the hum of the lights. "You currently owe me $14,000 in storage fees. The meter is running." The room erupted. People began shouting, waving papers, turning on the board members. Brenda slammed her gavel down repeatedly, screaming for order, but her authority was entirely gone. "You told us you had an easement." Sarah, the older board member, yelled at Brenda, abandoning any pretense of unity. "You told the board the access was legally cleared. The rental company sent us a notice of intent to sue this morning for $30,000. We only have $40,000 in the entire reserve fund." "It is a legal easement," Brenda shrieked, her face turning that familiar mottled crimson. "He is holding our community hostage. He is an obstructionist." I pushed away from the wall and walked slowly down the center aisle. The residents parted for me, their anger momentarily overridden by caution. I stopped 10 feet from the folding table and looked directly down at Brenda. "You forged a work order," I said, my voice cold and flat. "You signed a contract claiming you had access rights you knew you did not possess. You sent this man," I pointed back at Sullivan, "up a private mountain road, past 3 posted signs, and destroyed my driveway. Now a massive piece of commercial machinery is inches away from sliding into a ravine, and the county environmental office is waiting to find you into oblivion the second a hydraulic line snaps." I turned to face the room. The residents were dead silent, hanging on every word. "Behind lots 18 through 20, I continued, gesturing vaguely toward the windows. "That timber wall is going to fail. It will likely happen during the next heavy rain, which the forecast says is coming Thursday. When it fails, the mud will enter those homes. And because your board president engaged in fraudulent contracts, no contractor in this county will touch that hillside. You are radioactive." A woman near the front, whose house I knew sat directly beneath the failing wall, who started to cry softly into her hands. Tom, the nervous board member, leaned forward, his hands shaking. "What do you want? How do we fix this?" I looked at Tom. Then I looked at Brenda, watching the absolute ruin of her suburban empire reflect in her wide, terrified eyes. "I want 3 things," I told the room. "First, the HOA pays to repair my driveway entirely, using a contractor of my choosing. Second, you pay Sullivan every dime he is owed for the contract Brenda voided, plus a penalty for the loss of his equipment. Third, and this is non-negotiable." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost painful. "Brenda resigns as president, effective immediately. She surrenders her board seat, and she signs a legally binding admission of fault for the trespass and the forged contract. You do those 3 things, and I will waive the storage fees. I will allow a heavy recovery team onto my land to extract the excavator, and I will grant you a temporary, 1-week, strictly monitored access permit to fix your wall before your houses slide into the mud." I looked back down at Brenda. "Refuse and the truck rots on my mountain. The daily fines bankrupt your neighborhood by next month, and the mud takes your living rooms by Thursday." I turned my back on the board, walked back up the aisle, patted Sullivan on the shoulder, and walked out the glass doors into the humid night air. We did not need to wait for a vote. We already knew how it was going to end. Wednesday morning broke gray and heavy. I was sitting on the porch, watching dark clouds gather over the distant ridge, when Robert called. He did not say hello. He just laughed, a raspy, deeply satisfied sound. Sarah, the older woman from the board, had arrived at his office precisely when the doors opened. She carried a certified cashier's check to cover my road repairs, Sullivan's entire voided contract, and an additional penalty for lost wages. More importantly, she carried a single sheet of heavy bond paper, notarized and stamped by the county clerk. It was Brenda's formal resignation, complete with a legally binding admission of fault for forging the access authorization. The wicked witch of the cul-de-sac was officially dead. I hung up and walked down the mountain. Sullivan was already there, sitting on a jagged boulder near the front bumper of his trapped Peterbilt, smoking a cigarette. He looked up when he heard my boots crunching on the loose gravel. I nodded. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it firmly under his heavy work boot, and exhaled a long breath. We had the green light. I pulled my phone out and dialed Hank. 2 hours later, the mountain began to shake. It was not one heavy rotator wrecker this time. It was 2. They crawled up the steep driveway like massive, angry beetles, their huge diesel engines roaring against the unforgiving grade. Hank drove the lead truck, scanning the treacherous shoulder, another operator following closely behind in an identical rig. They stopped 50 yards short of the Devil's Elbow. Hank climbed out, looked at the cured clay gripping Sullivan's tires, and spat in the dirt. "All right," Hank yelled over the rumble of the idling trucks. "This is going to get extremely ugly before it gets pretty. We have to anchor the trailer before we even think about pulling the cab, or the whole yellow toy goes down the cliff." What followed was a master class in applied physics and raw mechanical violence. Hank's recovery crew worked with grim, silent efficiency. They carefully backed the first rotator up to the rear of the hanging lowboy trailer, massive hydraulic outriggers deployed from the sides of the wrecker, slamming down into my gravel driveway to completely stabilize the chassis. They ran thick, braided steel cables down the slope, attaching them securely to the rear axles of the trailer. This was the anchor. This would keep the 30-ton excavator from sliding laterally into the ravine when the pulling started. The second rotator moved into position directly in front of the Peterbilt. More outriggers deployed. They hooked massive chains directly to the heavy front tow points of Sullivan's cab. The damp air filled with the sharp smell of diesel exhaust, hot hydraulic fluid, and nervous sweat. Hank stood on the high side of the embankment, holding a wireless remote control for the winches. "Clear the line," Hank bellowed, waving his arm. Sullivan and I backed up the hill, putting 50 feet of solid distance between ourselves and the snapping point of the tensioned steel. If a cable broke under this kind of extreme load, it would cut a man in half before he even heard the snap. Hank hit the switch. The massive winches on both rotators engaged simultaneously. The heavy steel cables lifted off the ground, vibrating rapidly like giant guitar strings. The diesel engines of the wreckers revved higher, fighting the sheer dead weight of the entombed machinery. For 10 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The clay held on tight. The Peterbilt groaned. The yellow excavator shifted an inch to the left, the heavy metal tie-down chains screaming under the extreme torsion. Then the mud cracked. The vacuum seal of the cured clay violently broke apart with the sound of a cannon shot, sending large chunks of hardened red dirt flying into the tree line. The rear axles of the Peterbilt lurched forward with a sickening crunch. Hank Feather touched the controls, perfectly balancing the forward pull of the primary wrecker with the stabilizing tension of the rear anchor. Inch by agonizing inch, the rotator dragged the trapped truck out of the deep ruts. The rear wheels of the trailer scraped along the very edge of the abyss, kicking loose rocks down into the dark void below. But the anchor cable held true. 10 minutes later, the Peterbilt was sitting safely on flat, compacted gravel. The trailer was level. The excavator was secure. Hank killed the winches. The sudden silence ringing across the mountain was deafening. Sullivan walked slowly up to his truck. He placed both hands firmly on the hood, leaning his entire body weight against the cold metal. He stood there for a long time, his head bowed. The pure relief radiating from him was palpable. He had his livelihood back. He climbed up into the cab, turned the key, and the big diesel engine roared back to life. He leaned out the window, looked directly at me, and offered a single, sharp nod of respect. I nodded back. No words were necessary. The heavy wreckers escorted him slowly down the mountain. I stood at the Devil's Elbow and watched them disappear around the lower bend. The road was absolutely destroyed. Deep, jagged trenches and ripped tree roots scarred the hillside. But I did not care. The HOA was paying for every single yard of fresh, crushed stone, and the grading contractor of my choosing was charging double his usual rate. On Thursday, the sky finally broke open. A new earthworks company, operating under a strict access agreement, rushed their machinery up my newly graded driveway. They beat the catastrophic mudslide by roughly 3 hours. They drove thick steel pilings deep into the hillside behind lots 18 through 22, pouring massive concrete retaining walls that should have been built a decade ago. Down in the valley, the beige plague survived, but the atmosphere was permanently altered. Brenda put her pristine white SUV up for sale the following week. She stopped walking the neighborhood with her clipboard, drawing her blinds tight, becoming an absolute pariah in the community she once ruled with an iron fist. The HOA board had to levy a massive special assessment on every single homeowner in Whisper Ridge to cover the cost of my road repairs, Robert's legal fees, and Sullivan's massive payout. The residents finally understood the true, agonizing price of arrogant leadership. I still drink my dark roast coffee on the porch every morning. Before I watch the sun rise over the valley, casting long shadows across the identical rooftops below. My driveway is wider now, packed heavily with fresh, solid stone. The metal "No Trespassing" signs are exactly where I put them, bolted tight to their steel posts. The mountain is quiet again. It belongs only to the coyotes, the wind, and me. No one comes up the hill without asking anymore. That is exactly how you break a tyrannical HOA. You do not argue with them in their territory. You let the unyielding mountain do the talking. If you enjoyed watching a 30-ton mechanical nightmare crush the ego of a suburban dictator, do me a favor. Smash that like button, leave a comment below about the absolute worst HOA president you have ever dealt with, and share this story with anyone who respects a solid "No Trespassing" sign. Hit subscribe to join the channel for more stories where iron, gravel, and petty revenge always win out over pastel tracksuits and clipboard-wielding bullies. See you next time.